Hey everybody, Ronnie here. There was a time, not so long ago, when people went to work and did their jobs. Shoot, they actually did their jobs very well. They took pride in their work and went the extra mile so they could ensure that the job was done to the highest level of completeness and with the most quality. They worked hard, they put in extra time and effort, and they expected to be rewarded later for going above and beyond the call of duty. Now, back in those halcyon days, I'm talking 1970s and before, companies, mostly due to the negotiating power of labor unions and certain federal regulations, provided a living wage as well as a generous pension plan for their employees and comprehensive health care. The companies went the extra mile for their employees, and the employees went the extra mile for their employers. Then, in the 1980s, the government started removing many of the regulations that tied the companies to these benefits. It's important to note that there have also been many examples of pension plans being squandered or even outright stolen by those who were entrusted to protect them. Of course, many employers ended their pension programs for new hires during this time. And later, new health insurance plans were devised that moved much of the financial burden to the employee while reducing the level, and some may say quality, of the coverage. The companies were able to include these health plans in their benefits packages and pay less by shifting the cost over to the employees. By the turn of the century, there was a workplace dichotomy between the old guard that put in that extra effort and the new kids that just did their jobs. Keep in mind, many of these old guard types were still not very old, just in their 30s. But they continued to work under the rules that they were brought up with, the rules that they knew. Many earned promotions and pay raises that accompanied them and attributed their success with their go the extra mile work ethic. They didn't consider that they had just gained experience and their labor was more valuable because of it. It is important to note that inflation, while not exactly stagnant, was very low during this time, and the federal minimum wage actually kept pace. Basically, what you could buy for $1 in 1980 wouldn't cost that much more in 2000. But of course, things were about to change. Let's take a moment to mention the Fair Labor Standards Act. The FLSA was passed by Congress way back in 1938. It capped the standard work week at 44 hours and created a minimum wage of 25 cents per hour. By 1940, 2 years later, the work week cap had been reduced to 40 hours and the minimum wage was set to 30 cents per hour. While the work week cap has remained at 40 hours, the minimum wage has been increased 25 times since the act was originally passed. For example, my first job paid me $3.35 per hour back in 1984. I'm not going to say where I worked, but I will say that I got very good back then at asking, "Do you want fries with that?" The last time the federal minimum wage was raised was in 2009. It went from $6.55 per hour to $7.25 per hour. Why did we take this little side trip? Because something else was happening at this time that directly influences our story. This, of course, is going to be a greatly simplified explanation of what happened. But for most of the first decade of the 21st century, banks were making some high-risk loans, particularly in the housing market. And when I say some, I really mean a lot. based on those loans, the stock market soared to new highs, and so did oil prices. The higher oil prices led to a sharp increase in the price of gasoline. I remember the price in Pensacola, Florida, where I lived at the time, jumping from about $1.30 per gallon to over $3 per gallon very, very quickly. The sticker shock was real. People needed to start prioritizing how their few dollars were being spent. They needed gas to get to work so that they could make money, but the fuel cost more, in fact, more than double what they had budgeted for previously. Next, the adjustable rate mortgages that fueled the subprime home loans also skyrocketed. People who were living on a shoestring budget suddenly saw that shoestring snap. Evictions and foreclosures became rampant, and then the unemployment percentages rose. The basics cost more to buy, and people had less money to make purchases. People lost their homes, they lost their cars, and they lost their jobs. It really was a bloodbath. But things turned around. It took a few years, but they started to get better. Prices came back down, but not as low as before. People got jobs again, and some even started buying houses. Of course, the banks became much more selective about who they would lend to, and honestly, it wasn't uncommon for somebody to make a $1,000 rent payment every month and actually get turned down for an $800 a month mortgage. The fact is that's still true, but the numbers are much higher. Now we come to 2020. The federal minimum wage has been $7.25 an hour for 11 years. Prices are higher, but many employers have taken it upon themselves to ensure that they're paying a living wage, even if the federal government didn't agree. Many of the country's employers stuck to, or at least close to, the minimum wage. A few states had their own state mandated minimums that were more in line with real-world costs. Then COVID hit. The cost of COVID was bad. But due to advancements of internet technology, many of us were able to work remotely. Many in the service sector, restaurants, hotels, and the like, weren't quite so lucky. Many of the older Americans opted to just retire at this point. Mostly boomers, but some Gen Xers. And that opened up the workforce to the younger generations. The millennials and the Gen Xers took a new outlook on work. They did their jobs. They just did their jobs. Nothing more, nothing less. This has been termed quiet quitting. So what is quiet quitting? Well, it's not quitting. It's what many of us would actually call working. The employee arrives at work in time to start their shift. They do the job that they were hired to do, no more, no less, and then they leave or stop working. We do live in an age of remote working, but they do this at the prescribed time. They don't volunteer for overtime or do anything extra to outwardly show an interest in promotion. What they discovered is that their experience is just enough to ensure promotion, or at least to secure a job offer with better pay and benefits. Many of the companies that employ these people are not fans of the practice. They have taken steps against this trend. One way is by requiring mandatory overtime. So remember when we were talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act? It set the regular work week at 40 hours, but it didn't block longer work weeks. It just said an employee that works more than the 40-hour limit must be compensated at a higher pay rate, time and a half. Now, the quiet quitters are not lazy. The truth is that many of them, myself included, tend to work more and sometimes even harder than their predecessors. The folks that I have called the old guard. By doing only the job they were hired to do, quiet quitters tend to avoid old-fashioned burnout. It also leaves time for the quiet quitters to develop a side hustle. This is a second, non-traditional and perhaps less productive job. This could range from indie game developers or artists to dropshifters and social media influencers. This time for the side hustles is maximized by having a remote position for their primary job. Recognizing that productivity has dropped and many of the quiet quitters have even left, ironically, because their side hustles paid off, many employers have demanded a return to the office. Say, Elon, I don't think it'll work. I personally know several people who have quit, and not exactly in a quiet fashion, to maintain their remote status. I get it. I was a remote iOS developer. I was able to take, during this time, a 7-day cruise and still remains responsive to my work emergencies. I even managed to get some code out during the vacation. Not because I had to, but I do actually enjoy coding. You see, remote work is work, and even a quiet quitter is willing to do a little extra when they feel it's the right thing to do, or that it's something that they enjoy. So, are quiet quitters lazy? No. Are quiet quitters disloyal? Not at all. They're just as loyal as they feel their employer deserves, or as loyal as they feel their employer is loyal to them. Are quiet quitters the end of the workforce? Absolutely not. Quiet quitters are the backbone of the traditional workforce, and at the same time, they're the innovators of the future workforce. For all these reasons, and obviously many, many more, I would like to say, my name is Ronnie, and I have been a quiet quitter since 2023. Link in the description below. Thank you for watching this. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, please consider giving the video a like, and please consider subscribing. I'll talk to you next time.